this tutorial, I'll show you how to create a flipbook effect using BCC filters in Adobe After Effects. Hi, here I am in Adobe After Effects, and this is the finished product, a rendered video of it. It's a flipbook effect that starts off with just a nice slow page turn and then speeds up until we get animated images of the woman dancing. It's really fun to create, uses a lot of old school kind of techniques, but the end result is pretty good. So I'm going to show you how to do this using some footage I have here and this image of paper that I made just for this tutorial. So this will be included in the package, but other than that, I'm going to start in a new project. Here I am in a new project. I'm just going to bring in that dancer footage, and you can see her doing her ballet thing. It's great. So the first thing I'm going to do is add the BCC Pencil Sketch filter, which is in the Art Looks category. Just drop it on there. And if you're using this filter, make sure you're in full res when you set it up. You get a more accurate pixel reading there. And we're going to soften it out so it looks more hand-drawn. So increase soften to about 20. And we're going to change the line style to medium to make the lines show up a little bit better. I'm going to increase the line threshold to about 1.6. And then we're going to go into the advanced group and boost the contrast just a little bit, make the lines more visible. But we're also going to increase the soften max deviation to like 40. So it's going to smooth out details that wouldn't normally be there in a hand drawing. It just looks more natural, more realistic, but you still have kind of that nice soft, like ripply gray that looks like pencil marks. You also might have noticed that this was a green screen shot, and I could have gotten rid of the background and gotten a really clean edge on her, but since the filter makes the background pure white, since it's all solid color anyway, I actually prefer this look. So just pointing that out in case you were wondering, why bother use a green screen shot at all? Okay, now that we have her, let's bring in the paper. And the paper shot here is oversized for this comp, which is ideal because we're going to rotate and shift the position of the paper. So to do that, first let's make sure the drawing is transparent. I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply. Now it appears on the page. And let's also bring down the opacity to about 60 or so. So it really looks like it's on the page. And now I'm going to create an expression. So I'm going to go into the position and the rotation for the video track. I'm going to alt-click on those two stopwatches. And then I'm going to create a wiggle expression. So I'm just going to type wiggle and then parentheses 6, 4 end parentheses. That will make the position change 6 times a second with the value of 4 units. Similar for the rotation, I'm going to wiggle once a second, 1 degree. And then I'm going to parent, dragging this pick whip here, the paper to the video. So doing that, and I'm just going to drop down into half to get a quicker render for you guys. So doing that, it gives some life to the video. If the paper and drawing are totally static, it looks really generated, like obviously fake. And you don't want to have them wiggle too much either. That also looks fake. So this is a good range for this kind of effect. Of course, you can play with it a bit, but as you can see playing back here, it definitely helps. All right, so that sets up our drawing on the paper. Now we're going to rename that comp to source and create a new comp where we'll do the page turn effect. So I'm going to bring in the source again. So now let's do the page turn, and that's the BCC 9 perspective category page turn. It's a very classic effect. We have on-screen controls in our version, which is nice. So you can just click and drag on the video directly. A couple things I want to suggest for this sort of effect. You want the angle to be mostly down, since a flip book, you'd be flipping down a pad or something. And I also want to increase the flap radius, because you don't want it to be too sharp. So if anything, you want it to be really flat. So like the images are getting laid down for you almost flat each time. And that looks the best, I think. We're also going to increase a shadow to give some depth to the radius there. So you can see how that looks at different angles. Increase the flap radius again. And we could add light to the back of the page. It's another nice touch. Makes the paper look more three-dimensional, but we're not really going to notice it here. So I'll just put it up a little bit. Okay, now we're going to animate the offset. So we're going to start at 100, create a keyframe, go forward about 1 second, and create another keyframe at 0. So I'm going to zoom in on these two keyframes, and you can see nice animation here. Drop down to half just to get better timing. Again, remember your lines are not as accurate in half res or lower, so always check in full. But again, for the animation, I like to work in half. And this looks good. I might make this keyframe easy ease, so it's a little bit more natural. Same thing with the starting keyframe. Now these keyframes are going to end up so fast eventually that you won't even notice the interpolation, but when they're nice and slow, it pays to take effort to make them look good. Another thing I want to do is this last keyframe. Now I'm going to toggle hold keyframe on it. So when I loop this animation cycle, I only need the 2 keyframes. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So you'll notice I'm timing this up so it lasts about 1 second. So I'm going to do 3 loops where the cycle lasts 1 second each. And the hold keyframes, keep it nice and flat there, a little bit longer, which is good. Now once I get to about 3, then I start speeding up the cycle. So my pattern, which I think works pretty well, is I tend to half the length of the page turn, but increase the number of cycles each time I do that. So now that I've shortened the length of the page turn, I'm going to use more cycles to sort of compensate for that feeling. And it's not totally arbitrary. I tend to add a cycle each time I do this. So for example, I shortened it once and increased it by 1 turn. So and I'm going to shorten it again to about half. And again, I'm just going to increase the number of cycles by 1. So I had 4 before, so now I'm going to add 5. Again, if this is sounding confusing or you're not sure what I'm getting at, the basic idea is you want it to be speeding up. And you don't have to follow my pattern here, but it seems to work pretty well. I haven't found any ways to just sort of automatically create keyframes that do this in After Effects. So I'll speed ahead to when I'm done this process. And because it's happening so fast now, look at this. We only get like 1 image of the actual page turn, and then it's down. So when your page turn gets this fast, you have to change the starting and end point. So I'm going to make the starting keyframe about 80 and the ending keyframe like about 40. 35 there. So now we can actually see the paper even though it's happening so quickly. And again, just going to repeat this one. All right, and now we are at the point where it's every other frame. So this is great. When it's every other frame, all you need is 1 frame that looks good. So I'll make this one maybe like here, and then 1 frame where it's done, like there. And then you can just repeat these over and over again, which is what I'm going to do. And I can just copy and paste them at this point. Save some time. All right, that's good. Okay, so if we quickly look at this, you can see it speeds up very nicely. And this is a personal choice for me. You might just want to do the part where it's flipping very fast, or you might want to just have it be very slow, like a book effect. Both are good. Okay, so now that we have that set up, we have to change the direction of the page turn. So just like you don't want the paper too static, you don't want the page flip to be the same direction every time. So I'm going to use wiggle again. So I alt-clicked on the stopwatch. Just going to do wiggle about 3 times a second with a variance of about 12 degrees. So just slow enough that you won't notice it too much, but when it gets really fast, like down here, So you can see you do notice the change in angle, and it helps a lot. That way it's not just the same thing over and over again. Okay, so that is pretty much it for the page turn itself. I'm going to add a few more elements to this to make it look more realistic. First, we're going to add a posterized time effect. Now, the way this filter works, you have to make it the first effect in your stack, so make sure you put it above the page turn. And I'm going to leave the frame separation at 2. So that means it's only going to show us every other frame. And if that sounds familiar, that's because that's what we have here, every other frame. So we're timing the posterized time with the page turn to make it look like we're just getting a bunch of still images. And that's great. And we could try to animate the posterized time amount at the beginning here to time up with these keyframes. It's a headache. I don't recommend doing it that way. What we're going to do instead is use AE's time remapping. So we're going to enable time remapping, and this is the most tedious part of the effect. For every time we start a new page turn, just create a time remap keyframe. So the easy way to do this is just to keep going to the next keyframe twice on page turn, and then just create a keyframe on time remap. I'll speed this up for your sake, but basically do this until your page turn is so fast that it's happening every other frame. Okay, and I think we hit that point. So yep, there we are. So this is where it becomes every other frame, so we can stop generating these time remap frames. So it's a bit of a tedious amount of work to do that, but once you do, select all of them except the last one and select toggle hold keyframe. So this gives you a series of still images for every page turn effect. It makes a huge difference in how this feels. Without it, it's like video, but now it looks like you're actually going through drawings. It's a huge difference. That's why I take the time to do it. And once you've done that, you can duplicate this whole track, and on the one on the bottom, take off the page turn. So now we actually have paper staying underneath the page turn effect. It's out of sync though. Don't worry, it's pretty easy to fix that. Because it's always one cycle behind the page turn, we're just going to move these keyframes down one cycle. The only trick here is to make sure that they line up with this keyframe, the end of the page turn effect each time. And they will for the most part. They'll just change a little bit whenever they speed up. So however many times you sped up your effect will be how many times you have to realign them. Again, if they're always the same speed, you don't have to do this more than once. And those can line up, that's all right. I'll put it one behind, but it won't really matter. There, so now it looks like the drawing is actually being laid down each time. Again, I haven't found a faster way to do this yet. If you find one, that's awesome, but this works very well. And there's not that much to it, especially if you're not even going to have it accelerate. If you're just going to have it be fast the whole time, you can always just copy the keyframes. Okay, so we're almost done. Just a couple of final touches here. First, of course, we need a motion blur on the pages. I did save that for last because it does slow things down in terms of rendering. But I'm going to use CC Force Motion Blur right on the layer. And I'm going to change the shutter angle to 90 so we don't see quite so much blur happening. And when it gets really fast, like ridiculously fast here, I'm actually going to keyframe the motion blur samples down to 1. Basically turning it off just makes it faster. So the motion blur helps a lot, but once it gets so fast that we don't really see it anymore, we need something else. And this is kind of a trick I thought of. I'm going to create a new solid, I'm going to call it roll blur. And there's probably a few different ways to do this sort of thing, but I'm going to use the BCC filter Noise Map 2. It's a very obscure filter, but check this out. If we go into modulation, we're going to view the wave, and we're going to view the modulation. So we have all these auto-animating patterns that we can just play with, which is great. So I'm going to increase the intensity and the wave width. Make sure it's nice and bright. Increase the wave width quite a bit. going to change the waveform to a triangle. So what I'm going to do is line up these patterns with the page turn. I'm just going to bring down the opacity. That's a good frame to use. I'm going to change the direction so it more or less matches the page. And I'm going to increase the speed to about 60. So this will give the eye the impression that motion is happening downward. It's a great little trick. We don't need it to be on there the whole time. It doesn't hurt that much, but we want to use it primarily when we get to the every other frame part of our effect. About there. So I'm going to animate the opacity from 0, bring it up to like 15, keeping it pretty subtle, and change the blend mode to multiply. So this gives us like the feeling that motion is happening even if we don't see anything moving. It's a great little trick. Similarly, I'm going to take the actual page turn and drop the opacity around the same time. Not all the way, because it does look good to keep it there. Maybe bring it down to about 60 or so. And the very, very last touch we're going to add to this is a drop shadow. So I'm just going to use BCC Drop Shadow, apply to the page turn effect. It goes after the motion blur, just so make sure it is the last effect you do. I'm going to increase the distance, change the angle so it's right underneath the paper, and increase the softness all the way. Just one more touch to make sure it looks like the images are actually connected. But that is it. So that covers a very in-depth tutorial on creating this fun page turn effect. Now, if you liked what you saw here but don't own BCC, you can download a free trial version from our website and check out more tutorials. And that's all at boriseffects.com.